Welcome to our presentation on progressive discipline. My name is Warren Rutherford, and I'll be your presenter during this weekly Wednesday webinar series. When you're thinking about progressive discipline, oftentimes the first thing that comes to mind is termination or firing of an employee. And you probably have sound reasons for doing so, but our seminar today is to help you work through the progressive aspect of your disciplinary procedures. First, we're going to take a look today at the 4 steps that make up progressive discipline, and then we'll go over the reasons you should carefully investigate the facts before you start the progressive discipline process. And finally, we'll examine the importance of keeping accurate records. Preventing performance problems, the 3 Ps. First off, when you're hiring someone, promoting someone, or transferring them, try to make sure that you're assessing their performance for 6 months, and you're talking with the employee about their performance, behavior, and attendance. Encouraging communication from all employees is important. Asking them questions about how they're doing with their work or expressing concerns helps. You need to look at how you can resolve work-related issues that impact their performance and do it in a way that is fair and consistent, particularly when you're delegating. And when changes occur, be timely in advising your employees of what those changes are. Recognize good work verbally and in writing. And set goals and objectives so you can let employees know what's expected of them and how the department or company is doing. And last but not least, understand what your role as a supervisor, owner, or employee is within the employee handbook for your company. When you're going over any type of policy and procedure review, particularly of a disciplinary nature, it's important to look at your employee handbook to identify what the procedures are for progressive discipline, as well as the reasons why it can be applied. As an example, some employee handbooks will prohibit the use of alcohol on company property at any time with no exceptions. And it's important that you know that rule applies at all times during holiday parties. Letting your employees know of that progressive discipline policy is important, as well as making sure they know where it appears in the employee handbook. As I mentioned, there's a number of different elements to a progressive discipline policy. Essentially, there's 4. The oral warning, verbal warning, or counseling session. The written warning, which is usually entered in the employee's formal work record. Suspension or unpaid layoff ranging from a few days to a few weeks, and that'll vary by type of employee. And then, last but not least, discharge and termination. There's 3 main elements to disciplinary action: notice, consistency, and just cause. Let's look a little bit further at just cause. If you were to review these 8 steps, they may not apply in all instances, but many of them do. So let's consider them. Was the employee warned that an act would result in discipline? Did they receive training on the employee handbook to identify those actions that could result in disciplinary action? Was the policy that was broken related to efficient operations? Have you applied those rules consistently? Was an effort made to determine if the policy broken occurred prior to administering discipline? Did you conduct a fair and objective investigation? And did you give the opportunity for the employee to talk with you to explain his or her actions? You know, I've been in many situations as an arbitrator and hearings officer where the employee was never given an opportunity to talk about the alleged violation with his or her supervisor. Makes a difference as you go up the hearing chain and you identify areas where the employee wasn't given the opportunity to explain himself, making simple things mountains out of molehills. And last but not least, is the discipline considered related to the seriousness of the offense and the employee's work history record? Let's be clear. Some matters do warrant immediate dismissal. Yes, there are 4 steps of progressive discipline that are standard for less serious matters. A serious on-the-job criminal act, such as violence or vandalism, might lead to instant dismissal. There are other serious infractions, such as intoxication on the job, where you might skip steps and proceed right to suspension. Other serious matters warranting immediate dismissal could be possession or use of drugs on company property, extended unexcused absences, sexual harassment, destruction of company property, insubordination, and/or gambling. And bear in mind, these all need to be defined within your employee handbook. So you have an instance where there may be a violation of policy. What do? Before you consider implementing any type of discipline, make sure you investigate the facts. Don't rely on gossip. Make sure the charges are formal and well documented and not some type of personal revenge. Whenever you implement your company's policy, document everything and have the employee sign all documents. It's a great way to provide yourself with maximum protection against claims of wrongful discharge. Let's talk a little bit about progressive discipline steps. One of the advantages of a system is that you can work with employees to try to improve their job performance without immediate termination. Typically, discipline starts with a verbal warning. Make sure you're clear about the employee's infraction, state a reason for the reprimand, and give the employee a period for improvement. Tell the employee what the consequences are for failing to improve. The next step is usually a written warning. The written warning is quite serious, detailed, and specific as to time and place. The written warning tells the employee what he or she must do in the future. And there's going to be a place on a verbal and written warning document for the employee to comment, and both the supervisor and the employee should sign and date the document. And oftentimes I've had circumstances where the employee refuses to sign the warning, and I just note that on the document. Now, a little bit of what appears to be an inconsistency. I've just said you issue a verbal warning, oral warning for the first step. Well, it's a verbal warning. So why do you need to document it? You need to put in an employee's file that a verbal warning was issued on such and such a date and time for such and such an infraction. And you should sign it and have the employee acknowledge it. They may or may not agree, but if they don't, acknowledge that they refuse to sign it. Otherwise, how do you know whether or not there's going to be the ability to trace back when that verbal warning was given? So document it in some way. I suggest doing it in the employee file. And then if the employee does not improve, the next step can be a formal conference where you talk about increased progressive disciplinary action. The next step in the process, suspension. I think the 2 statements above say it fairly well. Suspension's that next step if employees don't improve their performance. The policy should be clear on the details of the suspension, and it should be unpaid. An exempt employee, one who is salaried, in order to be suspended without pay, should be for 1 full pay period of 1 week. A non-exempt or hourly employee minimum can be much less than that. Several hours, up to a week, 2 weeks, your choice, but you can do it on a day-to-day basis as well. The amount of time doesn't have to be the same for all infractions. Think about that. You could have a policy that calls for as little as 1 day for certain infractions to as much as a week for more serious violations. And I recommend highly to clients that we don't put the time frames at all in. It's on a case-by-case basis. Just make sure you apply the suspension policy evenly. And take into account the need to make sure that it's distributed evenly and fairly without regard to any of the protected class groups in an organization. So, the last step is termination for serious violations. If prior steps have failed, now you consider termination. Some employees, let's face it, just won't change, regardless of the opportunities presented to them. And if you've gone through steps and documented them well, you've helped protect yourself against a charge of wrongful discharge. Some violations are so serious, as I said earlier, you might skip these prior steps. For instance, stealing, drunkenness, drug use, workplace violence, not acceptable, not tolerated, and may justify, depending on the circumstances, immediate termination. But make sure you investigate first. Some situations aren't what they appear. And follow the process of having a hearing, having a meeting, and look at alternatives. Is demotion, reassignment, or resignation possible? In certain instances and organizations they are. In other instances, they're not practical. Okay, let's talk about creating that paper trail, documentation. And I'm not saying the file folders that are on the screen right now are what you result with, but record keeping is very important when using a progressive discipline policy. Consider creating a form for each step in your procedure, or one that covers all steps. I've had clients ask me to develop for them standard format letters for verbal warnings, written warnings, suspensions, and terminations, and they fill in the blanks. And the forms give them the guides to follow when they're issuing those letters and policies. Be clear you're telling the employee what rule was violated. It's possible the employee was unaware. The record should be kept in the employee's personnel file for a predetermined time that's in your company's progressive discipline policy. And those written records should include date, time, and place of infraction, factual details of the incident, specific rules violated, remedial steps you recommend to avoid further action, and yours and the employee's signature. The negative side to record keeping is you have to keep the documentation. The positive side to it is you're making more objective decisions based on objective information in a clear paper trail that helps you should someone claim wrongful discharge. So, as I've reviewed, there's 4 basic steps in the disciplinary process. Remember not to rely on hearsay. Investigate the facts and protect yourself and the organization by creating a paper trail. Well, I don't want to let you get off too easy, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a quiz. So write down the answers to these questions, and in a minute I'll give you the answer to each. First off, name 4 serious infractions that might call for immediate termination. You've got 10 seconds. Okay, if you thought stealing, workplace violence, drug use, gambling, sexual harassment, destruction of company property, insubordination, or extended unexcused absences, and you got at least 4 of those, you're right on. Next statement, the first step in a progressive discipline policy is usually a written warning. True or false? Those of you who have raised your hands for true, think again. The answer is false. The first step is a verbal or oral warning. Next up, who should make the final decision? Well, I didn't talk about that, did I? That was a trick question. It's your company attorney. And fourth one, what do you do when an employee refuses to sign a written warning? Make a note on the warning that the employee refused to sign. How are we doing so far? 4 for 4? Well, that third one might have tricked you up there. All right, 3 for 4 at least. All right, on this page, 4 more questions. What are the typical 4 steps of progressive discipline? 5 seconds. If you've guessed verbal, written warnings, suspension, and termination, you've been listening, or you went to school on it. Next question. Why is it important to have steps of discipline? Well, simply put, to be fair to employees and to protect employers from charges of wrongful discharge. All right, getting into the home stretch. What information must a written warning include?